Let's check out a new narrative SRD today. Thank you all for joining us again here today on Hastings County for another SRD talk. This video series takes a look at system reference documents, generic role-playing systems, and other different mechanics or sets that you could use and combine together to create your own role-playing games. Today, we're going to be taking a look at a primarily narrative-based system that is called Monad Echo. This is put out by World Anvil Publishing and Black Box Games. They are based in Italy, so this is actually available in both English and Italian in case you're interested. Before we go into anything else, let's go ahead and discuss a little bit of the basics of this system. As I mentioned at the stinger at the beginning, this is a primarily narrative-focused SRD. The system, in many ways, relies on the idea that the players are initiating and are leading the narrative, and that the facilitator is basically helping things along and, obviously taking on the role of the various NPCs and whatnot, just like in many other role-playing games. But again, as I mentioned, the main idea is that the players are sort of driving things, and also that the mechanics of the game itself are built around only intervening when absolutely necessary, and also on leveraging description primarily through what they refer to as descriptors or keywords. And those descriptors, in many ways, remind me of the way that Fate uses aspects. Basically, they're elements of your character or the environment or another, an NPC or something else going on, a situation that could potentially be influencing a role should it be necessary. Or, of course, descriptors can, of course, influence how the narrator and the players interact with the actual narrative. Speaking of resolution, this system also utilizes a points and dice combined resolution system that in many ways reminds me of a couple of systems that we've discussed in the past, like the Passkey system, as well as the Cypher system, in that the choice to resort to dice in only certain situations, in combination with the idea that only players are rolling, in many ways is again reinforcing that idea that the narrative is in the hands of the players and they're sort of taking the lead on things. Finally, I just wanted to also go ahead and add that in addition to the fact that this is available in both English and Italian on their website, this is also a Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 licensed material. So that means that you can use, at least the text is. So you can use the text in any way that you'd like, again, as long as you give them attribution. Now, one thing that I feel will help explain some of the basic aspects of this system a bit better is if we actually take a look at the sort of the way that this game does checks. So on the slide here, you'll see the various steps, and we'll kind of go through and explain all of the words in bold there. But what's most important to kind of start off is, again, to emphasize the idea is that checks are not done frequently. There's two different kinds of checks, but the difference is really just semantics because the structure is basically the same. Normally, the player is just sort of narrating what their character does, and at times when the outcome would be unsure, whether it's because your player or the player character is attempting to do something that there's not necessarily a guarantee of success. That would require a one type of check. And then the other type of check might come up whenever your player is potentially going to be impacted by a threat. The first four steps are done primarily by the narrator. And the first one is to, of course, set an opposition level. The opposition level is basically a difficulty number, essentially, for the threat or for the action, whatever the player is attempting to do, or whatever's attempting to act against the player, a character. That opposition has a set number. which I believe like the biggest ones are like in the low teens, but those are for like basically like, your boss characters. And most of the time it's somewhere under 10. Basically, that opposition level is the number of successes that a character needs to reach in order to achieve whatever task they want to get, whatever outcome they'd like to have. The next thing that they do is they assess the various drawbacks that could potentially be involved in this situation. So, drawbacks would be things that the character has accrued over the course of previous play, or a situation where basically these are disadvantages. Like on a previous roll, they might have gained a drawback because of something, some cost that they had to pay for not quite succeeding. So those are all things that would be assessed at this time. So and then finally the narrator would be assigning an attribute, and each of the characters has. We'll talk more about them later, but each of the character has a set of attributes that basically gives them a certain number of base successes. Now, once the narrator has determined all of this, basically the narrator has passed on to the player, okay, here's your target number because of the opposition level and the various things influencing this roll. And here is the attribute that your character would need to use. Then what the player will do is they'll start looking through their descriptors specifically for their character or in the scene, to try to identify descriptors that would benefit their character. If they do manage to find something, then this means that later on they can potentially use what the game refers to as stoma, which essentially are story points. But we'll talk about that more in a couple minutes. And then what they'll do is they'll consult whatever the attribute score is, and that will help them determine the base number of successes that they already have. So we've determined our base number of successes because we know how many points we have in our attribute, which is normally but somewhere between like 2 is like usually the absolute lowest I would expect an attribute to be in this system, and 7 would be the absolute highest. But normally it's somewhere between uh, probably like 3 and 5 or something like that. So then adding to that, what the player would do is the player would add up any advantages that they might have gained in previous rolls, which would of course be giving them additional successes, or they can tap into gifts. Now, gifts essentially are special abilities, because the idea in this system is that the characters are already somewhat powerful individuals. You're not like starting at level 1. If we were comparing this like a D&D system or something, a traditional role-playing game with a leveling system, you don't start at level 1 and work your way up. Instead, what you're probably doing is you're starting more like at like level 5. Um, and there's less upward progression and more sort of an outward progression, where your character is already has a base level of competency, and yes, you can specialize some of that competency, but a lot of it also is going to be increasing the amount of competencies that you have. So in any case, the gifts are essentially those special abilities that your character might have that might give you an advantage in certain roles, might give you certain narrative bonuses in some ways, or allow you to do certain narrative things in exchange for a cost. Yeah, basically they'll determine what advantages they have. They'll use any gifts, which might also be giving them advantages. Then they'll resolve the advantages and the drawbacks against each other. Basically, they eliminate each other on a 1-by-1 basis. And you can have a maximum, I believe it's like of 3 advantages or drawbacks in a roll. And each advantage adds a success, and each drawback removes a success. At least that's my understanding. Then it's time to potentially add additional successes. So basically, at this stage, once we've added together our base successes, any advantages that we might have that aren't being canceled out by drawbacks, and the benefits from any gifts that we might have, if that level of success has already hit whatever outcome the player wants to get, they're done. You don't need to do anything more. However, if they're still below the level of the level of success that they want to be at, like let's say if the opposition level for this activity is, let's say, a 7, my attributes are a 5, and I have an advantage that with my bumping up to 6. So I'm not at 7 yet. So how would I get additional successes to try to go over that 7? I basically have two choices. If my character has a descriptor that applies to this situation. So for example, let's say I'm trying to hit a target with a gun, and my character happens to have a descriptor that would suggest that they should be good at using guns. Then presumably they would have the ability to utilize those soma or story points. Basically, for each story point or soma my character uses, which they have a pool we'll discuss later, for each point they use, that increases the additional successes by 1. So it's 1.1 success. Obviously, if let's say I just wanted a base success, I'm 1 below. So that means I need 2 to get a base success instead of success at cost, right? So my character could spend 2 soma points, boop, boop, and get over. However, if for some reason my character is out of soma points, or I don't want to spend soma points, or if this situation doesn't have a descriptor, like for example, instead of shooting the gun, my character has to chase somebody down, and they don't really have a descriptor that implies that they should be like fast or good at pursuing people or anything like that, then that means that my character would not be able to utilize soma points. Instead, what we would do is we would use dice. In this system, we're only using D6s, and you actually have a pretty good chances of success, because for each die that you roll, if you roll a 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6, so 2 through 6, anything other than a 1, then that counts as an additional success. But if you roll a 1 on any of the dice that you're using, then that means that this action automatically fails no matter what. So in my character, they'd say they have like 6 successes so far, and the opposition level is 7. I could roll 2 dice, or a combination of soma and dice to try to get them up to 7 or maybe even an 8. So let's say I want to get up to an 8, so I roll 3 dice. If any of those dice show a 1, I fail. If I do nothing, then I would still fail because I haven't hit at least 7. There is that risk that, of course, with each die you add, incrementally increases the probability that you're going to, because remember, you only need to roll a 1 on one of those dice. So each die that you add to the roll makes it more and more likely that you're going to fail, which definitely to me adds a feel to the idea that you are definitely pushing your luck, like similar to what you'd have in, like, for example, the push system from Cesar Cabalque. Once I have rolled those dice and I've added my additional successes, or spent my soma points and added my additional successes, we determine the final outcome, which again would be a fail if I'm under the opposition level number, a success with costs if I'm equaling it, a regular success if I'm one above, and then like a success with benefits or with advantage or whatever, 2 above. And of course, there are certain situations where, especially if we're like engaging a threat or some sort of opposition that is relatively weak, where their opposition level will be low enough that simply that the best successes, the base successes that we mentioned in step 6 might be enough, and then that'll be the end of it. In which case, at that point, it might just be, you might still want to go through the process of resolving steps 7 through 10, especially if you want to have a higher level of success. So that's the basics of how an action or check works in Morad Echo. And again, just to remind you, these are things that are not generally expected to be happening very frequently. And again, there are things that are only done by the player. The narrator is never actually going to be rolling a check. So here are some of the basics of the anatomy of a character in this system. Um, each character is basically going to have 5 attributes. These are going to be in a standard this sort of standard generic Moed Echo system. It's going to be body, reaction, presence, mind, and anomaly for like supernatural powers and stuff. Um, each of those 5 added together should equal 15 at the time of character creation. Um, and there are actually some recommended of some recommended scales that they have that they recommend in the manual of like a 4-3-3-3-2 or a 4-4-3-2-2 or a 5-3-3-2-2 instead of just going straight threes across everything. Because of course, then the character's a lot less interesting. You don't really have any advantage or disadvantage no matter which sort of attribute is being applied to this particular action. I did put an asterisk there on the slide because they do actually suggest that there are ways that you could do this by completely getting rid of the attributes. If you decide not to use attributes, then instead what you could do is have each of the players get 3 base success points if they have a descriptor that would apply, but only 1 if a descriptor would not apply. Instead of limiting the spending of soma to you having to have a descriptor, instead you'd be able to spend soma whenever you want. Partly to make up for the fact that the base success can't really be improved, and then also to sort of make up for the fact that both the 3 and the 1 are typically lower than what your value might be if you were actually utilizing attribute points. Each character should, in general, have 5 gifts. As I mentioned, gifts are one of those things where they're basically like the powers or the special abilities that your character has. I'm not going to elaborate any more on that here beyond just because of each gift has a certain elements that kind of fit together, which provide you sort of like a point cost. For when it comes to character creation. But beyond that, I'm not really gonna go into any specific detail on what some of those things are, aside from like sometimes in order to trigger more powerful abilities, you'll have to pay a cost, or have some sort of specific triggering event occur prior to. You have to be in some sort of triggering situation prior to being able to activate it or stuff like that. Soma would be, again, those story points. Each character would be starting off with a pool of between 5 and 15 Soma points. However many points they have will be based on the power of their gifts. If they have like a bunch of really weak gifts, then they might have closer to 15. If they have a bunch of more powerful gifts, it'll be closer to 5, but an average would probably be like around 12 based on the distribution of powers of various gifts and stuff. It is generally recommended that to help out with initial creation, that the person creating a game utilizing this system should try to create a set of 5 steps that basically help with that initial creation, basically like having you answer a series of prompts or do something along those lines. This is in part to help build out your character, especially all of the elements that we're mentioning here, but also could contribute a bit to like creating the game world if you haven't necessarily done that yet, which you do through a series of sharing of keywords like a session 0, essentially. Or also these initial sort of creation steps will help you with just sort of fleshing out the basic idea of what your character is outside of the mechanics themselves, which of course in a narrative game is incredibly important. Your character will then have a set of descriptors. These are going to be things that, again, are describing your character, their past, like, so that you can kind of get a good picture of what their abilities are. Or again, they're things that would be triggering the character's ability to either tap into Soma or, again, in that alternative attribute system. The manual, I've read through it a couple of times, but I still haven't seen any references to exactly how many descriptors the characters should have. However, in at least one game based on this system that the creators have made, the it actually said that its character creation system has the character having 3 descriptors. So that feels like a good base number to have. I know a lot of things that we're talking about here on the screen are like coming in groups of 5, but 5 descriptors seems like a little much. Um, but, obviously, if you're making a game, you do you. And then finally, this is sort of like an optional sort of set of rules where the character would have a set of bonds. They'd be starting the game with like 2 bonds, could have up to 4 bonds. So yeah, the idea is that they would be starting with 2 bonds with characters and 2 bonds with NPCs, partly to sort of again to play the narrative, or those could kind of tie into checks in some capacity, or might be required for certain gifts, but also is just sort of building out the narrative and pre-existing relationships and stuff like that, which of course is important for storytelling. So that was Monad Echo. Again, this was created by World Anvil Publishing and is available in both on their website, and I believe it's also on Drive-Thru RPG in English, and is available on their website in Italian. If you get this system through their website, you are able to get it along with one of their own Monad Echo hacks called Ruin. And that is available in both English and in Italian, and those are for free, unless you're getting like a physical version. For these, for PDFs, they're free. So you can get this PDF, of course, that for Monad Echo, that the cover of which you see here on the screen, and of course that Ruin that I mentioned. Another thing that they used it for was a game that they had kickstarted relatively recently called Broken Tales. Just to sort of recap my own feelings and thoughts about reading Mohead Echo, again, it gives me lots of vibes and reminders of narrative systems that either I've read before or that we've covered on the channel before. Again, it reminds me a lot of like Passkey and Fate and the Cypher system and a number of things like that. And also, it has some similarities to like some games that I've made myself. And yeah, so it's again, this is very narrative focused. The idea is that your characters already are at least somewhat powerful, even from the beginning. Would not want to use this in any sort of simulationist system. Things like gear and stuff like that are basically like a lot of other narrative games. Things like gear and stuff are kind of pushed off to the side. And the basic idea is if it seems reasonable that your character would have it, they have it, that kind of stuff. So that the emphasis can be on like the actual narrative action that is occurring. And again, sort of trying to limit the roles so that they're not going too far. So again, this would be probably a good system to utilize for games that are involved in playing with characters that are already legendary or mythological, or at least situations or scenarios that are mythological. You could also potentially do things like sci-fi and fantasy and stuff like that with this, or like if you did want to do a more sort of modern day, less sci-fi-ish sort of a thing, you would still probably want to do, or a less fantastical thing, you'd still probably want to do something along the lines of, like, say, a John Wick. John Wick would be good in this system, I think, or something along that line would work. So yeah, that is Monad Echo. Again, links can be found in the doobly-doo down below. Thank you for joining us again here today on Hessens County. Don't forget to rate your itch purchases, or wherever you may rate your purchases, wherever you may get them. And have a good sale.